This should be coming at a time that is pertinent and useful to you all. It is, if you're hitting round one deadlines, there's still time for you guys to fix some of the things if you find yourself guilty of some of the things in this presentation. If you're hitting round two, then you have a lot more time, which is great. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about who we are, obviously. We're going to talk about 5 major pitfall buckets, if you will, and then we'll end with a Q&A, which, if I had been looking at earlier, I would have noticed I had been on mute. So, who are we, and who's this voice? Well, the voice is, my name is Bobik. I'm the managing partner here at Critical Square. We are a firm, we are obviously admissions consultants, and we are a firm absolutely dedicated to story. We'll talk about story a little bit later when we talk about pitfalls, but it's something that we've really focused on in everything that we do. We were storytellers professionally before this, and now we use those skills to help applicants articulate where they're coming from and where they're trying to go. And we've helped them, we help clients whether they are completely lost or if they are totally ready to get after it and do things. If you, just as a side note before we kind of get into the main webinar, if you are looking to work with us in round one, either with a strategic package or a comprehensive package, the last day to purchase those services will be August 17th, which is Monday. After that, tactical, hourly, and a la carte only. Because we, round one deadlines are almost here, and we want to make sure that people who do work with us have the time and effort that is required to do a good job. So with that said, let's dive into the first pitfall, putting money on the wrong horse. So what do I mean by that? A lot of times when people go through the application process, they find themselves either lacking self-awareness or potentially being misaligned between what they want and what they need, or what they think they're going to do and what they actually end up doing. And those kinds of misalignments, those kinds of lack of awareness can be a huge issue. And so let's talk about the first kind of component of this, school selection and chance assessment. Chance assessment is essentially what we would, when we talk about chance assessment, it's what you think about your strengths and your weaknesses, how you think that's going to play into the applicant pool, how you think that's going to play in with the schools that you're targeting, essentially what are your stretch, your aligned, your safety. A lot of times people do a very cursory job at this. They look at the website, they look at median GMAT scores, and they call it a day. Sometimes people do something even worse, and that's talk to individuals on forums, right? Or they'll troll a forum. Forums are great, but at the end of the day, you have to take everything you hear kind of with a grain of salt. And then that chance assessment then leads to school selection. And the school selection component of this is equally important, because not only do you have to take into account your chances and what you think of your profile and its strengths and its weaknesses, but also what you want, right? If you want to be risk averse and you pick very risky schools, you're probably in for a bad time, right? That misalignment can cause a lot of consternation as you go through this process, and a lot of applicants tend to get into that predicament after round one or round two. They think that they are a better applicant than they actually are, so therefore they apply to a certain set of schools, and they don't get the results that they were looking for because their chance assessment, their school selection was off. So the kind of setting yourself on the right path at the beginning is, obviously very important. But it's something that even if people have the best of intentions, they can do incorrectly at times. The other is ineffective intro or multi-year strategies. This is essentially how are you going to apply and when are you going to apply, right? Are you going to apply across multiple rounds? Do you have to go this year, or can you be a reapplicant next year? So essentially, what's your round one, round two, round three, and what's your multi-year strategy? This year, next year, wait 2 years. What's kind of the strategy there? And not having thought through that can can sometimes lead people into situations where they don't know how to get out of them. So for example, if they put a lot of all of their eggs in around one strategy that was super risky and they weren't trying to be super risky, they may find themselves in November or December with no acceptances and just a terrible position to be in. So not only thinking about your chances and your schools, but thinking about what your overarching strategy is going to be is super important, which leads us to part 3 of this, which is no plan B. So for example, let's say there's something about your profile that you find weak, like your involvement. Well, if you know that's going to be the case, then your involvement needs to be you need to start working on your involvement the moment you start on your applications, because if you don't get in and you do have a multi-year strategy, then it's better to have had 12 months working on a weakness than 6 months. Or if you're getting on the older side and you don't have the opportunity for a multi-year strategy, then what is your plan B professionally, right? If you don't like what you're doing, what are you going to try to do otherwise? So knowing what your plan Bs are, what your parallel paths are, is an incredibly important thing to do, because if you don't, you could find yourself in a position where you could have set yourself up for success but didn't. So that's kind of the first pitfall bucket. What's the second one? Well, story. I mentioned at the beginning that we are a firm dedicated to story, excessively so. And I think a lot of times our clients don't realize just how dedicated to story we are when they sign up, but I guarantee you they find out by the end of it, and that's for a reason. Because this pitfall bucket is where the vast majority of trip-ups happen for applicants. The first, when you have severely disconnected stories and goals. What do we mean by that? It means where you've been to where you're trying to go doesn't make any sense. And a lot of times people think that just because they're going to business school, they will be able to conduct this switch. Now, of course, business schools allow for career transitions and career changes. Obviously, if you go to a full-time program, that's more so the case than a part-time, which is more so the case than an executive, etc. But a lot of times, people think that just because they're going to a top-ranked MBA program, that they can make kind of magic happen with their career, and that is not the case. You can try, but when you're talking about stories, when you're talking about goals through the application process, the focus has to be on, I'm at A, I'm going to B, then C, then D, logical progression. And a lot of times people forget that to get these jobs that they're so marvelously touting to the admissions committee, a recruiter will have to interview them and accept them. And a lot of times, if you look at certain applicants' backgrounds, there's no way a recruiter is going to hire them for that. And that leads to an admissions committee thinking you may be an immature applicant, right? Your goals reflect and serve as a proxy for your maturity, which also kind of leads us to goals that are too broad and generic. So consulting, super common application goal, super common post-MBA job, right? 35, 40, 45% of people going to consulting. Business schools can be a consultant factory, and that's perfectly fine. So going to school to become a consultant, hey, more power to you. And a school doesn't want to not hear that simply because you think that's all they hear. I mean, of course, consulting is very popular, but there's a lot more to consulting than just consulting. Is it tech consulting, strategy consulting, management consulting? Are you going to focus on a particular industry? Are you going to focus on a particular service line, region, stage of growth? Consulting in and of itself, to say I want to become a consultant, is not an answer. Same thing goes for investment banking. There's a lot to investment banking. There's sales and trading, there's M&A, there's IPO and kind of transactional components to investment banking isn't an answer. So having goals that are too broad and generic is a pitfall. Now, granted, you don't want to become too specific because that could trip you up as well, but you don't want to become too broad and too generic. There's a balance. And that leads us to kind of the third part, which is putting together stories that you think the admissions committee wants to hear. There's no such thing, right? A lot of times people will come to us and be like, well, I'm applying to Kellogg. Should I have a marketing story? Like, you're an engineer, you can't have a marketing story, right? Or going to Columbia and creating and crafting a finance story out of thin air. They want to hear stories that are authentic, well-researched, and logical, and ambitious, right? There is no such thing as want to hear. So that's one of the major pitfalls to try to, does that mean that your stories can't be customized? No, and they absolutely should be, but they shouldn't be fabricated to fit some sort of stereotype. So that leads us to the third pitfall, which is checking boxes. What do we mean by this? Well, checking boxes is kind of the conception that once you have certain things in an application, that you should be in the clear and on your way. It's not the case. So the first one is involvement. When we say involvement, we don't necessarily mean community involvement. We mean any involvement. So hobbies or thought leadership or, yes, community involvement. Community involvement or any sort of involvement is a long-standing tradition in your life. And schools care about this because you're going to be in their program and they want you to be involved. So it's an important thing to programs. So having something where you volunteered for a couple of hours every month or something you started last week isn't going to cut it. It's not going to say, oh yeah, I was involved in something, check the box. No, they want something deeper. They want passion. They want hobbies. They want to see that you've been well-rounded for a significant portion of your life and that you're willing to kind of get involved and get dirty. So that's perhaps one of the biggest things. People who will have free consultations all the time, and people will have done nothing for 5 or 6 years, and they'll be like, well, I joined this organization yesterday. That's not going to help you. It's too late, right? You have to think about those things ahead of time. This isn't a check the box kind of component. Or overemphasis on experience pedigree. So by that we mean where they've worked or where they've gone to school. There was a free consultation I had a little while ago, and we were talking about schools, we were talking about chances, we were talking about risk, and the person interrupted me kind of halfway through the conversation. They're like, but I don't understand. I went to this great undergrad, and I now work at this kind of globally one of the best in their particular field companies. I don't really see that, I should be a shoo-in. I don't think these are stretch schools. And that kind of thinking can lead you to a trap of mediocrity. And as I told that particular individual, he was the third person from that company, from that same exact undergraduate institution, that I had talked to that week. People think that they are more unique than they are. And thinking that where you went to school or who you work for is going to be an automatic kind of golden ticket is well, it's ridiculous, but it's also not true. Right? It's just not going to work that way. And then the last one is kind of research in name only. So what do I mean by research in name only? I mean, just kind of, oh, I talked to a couple of students, I looked on the website, done. School research complete, awesome. The fact of the matter is schools want to see you invested. They want to see you nurturing those relationships. They want to see you talking to students who make sense, right? Not just a random students who may be trying to do what you do or came from where you came from. They don't want you to just look on the website. They want you to maybe visit or talk to alumni or really get to know the culture, right? They want you to be invested. They're going to be invested in you, and they want you to be invested in them. Especially at the top programs where a lot of schools know that they're going to be getting applications from people who are applying to all of their top competitors as well. And so research in name only, research is not a check the box exercise. Just because you can write somebody's name where it says, who did you speak to, does not mean that you've done this well. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Pitfall 4, rinse and repeat. One of the biggest ones that a lot of people fall into. Using, for example, the same essays and resume for every school. Shouldn't do that. Maybe you can leverage some material between programs, but that's rare. And even if that is the case, I would suggest doing it with a little bit of caution. If you're applying to the top programs, even your resume should be a bit different. right? Maybe you should be highlighting different experiences or using different adjectives, conveying different themes. Subtle word choice can make a huge difference. And the same goes for essays. Like I said, you want to customize your stories for each of these schools. So even if it is something, such as a common essay about career goals, you still want to, make that unique to that particular school. And sometimes people think that they can use one particular essay for another essay prompt, even though they're not entirely the same. Guess what? Admissions directors at the top schools, or any school, know what their competitors ask, and they'll be able to very easily tell that all you did was copy and paste. Using the same essays and resumes is a bad idea. And the same goes for your recommendations. A lot of times people say, oh, well, I wrote one recommendation and they're starting to use the same questions, so, why reinvent the wheel? I'll just send this in for everyone. But the fact of the matter is, for the same exact reasons you want to showcase different themes, strengths, and weaknesses in your essays and your resume is the same reason you want that same strategy to be taken into account for your recommendations. And so having the same themes, paraded around in recommendation after recommendation when you're trying to adjust the rest of your application to fit a particular school, hopefully you see kind of what's wrong with that picture. And a lot of times people will think, well, a recommender is busy and I don't want to ask them for this work. The fact of the matter is, this is a very important part of the process, and they are a part of it. And you've asked and they've accepted, and that carries responsibility. So obviously you want to prep them. Obviously you want to give them as much information as possible, but don't be shy about asking them to adjust a recommendation for different programs. And lastly, that goes the same for the online application itself. Maybe you want to reorder the involvement activities that you were in. Maybe you want to talk about different accomplishments versus other schools, or maybe you want to showcase different examples or awards. Not every application proof is the same, right? Just because they have the same questions doesn't mean you have the same answers. So making every part of your application customized for a particular school is an important thing. And when a lot of times people will apply to a high number of schools in a particular round. This is where those applications suffer, because they don't have time to customize. They don't have time to research, and they don't have time to put forward their best foot. So that leads us to the fifth pitfall: fancy recommendations. So what do I mean by that? Well, a lot of times people value title over substance. And generally that's a mistake, right? There's a balance between the two. For example, there was a client of ours, a consultant. We were talking about recommendations, and he was like, well, I work with a senior consultant, and I think she would write a great recommendation for me. And my comment to him was, that's too low. That title is too low, right? But on the flip side, that doesn't mean, oh, well, I can't get the senior consultant. I'll just get a managing director to write it. That if that person hasn't worked with you, if that person doesn't know you inside and out and can't write a substantive recommendation, then their title is useless. And I think a lot of times people think, well, if I get my partner or managing director or CEO to write this, it's going to carry a lot of weight. And those recommendations can carry a lot of weight if they're backed up by substance. But the chances that you work very, very closely with a high-ranking partner or very, very closely with a CEO are probably low, right? And so it would be my recommendation to think about who the ideal people are that are well regarded within the within your company or firm, or have the title that is impressive, and at the same time can still know you enough to write a good recommendation. The third one is the fire and forget, and a lot of times people do this, right? Whether it is I asked them to write a recommendation and I never said another word to them, or I sent them a prep packet, notes, and everything. A lot of times people just share some information, share the deadline, and that's it. They never go back to it. And they hope that the recommender will kind of do things that they want. And that's not the right way to kind of look at it. You have to be engaged in the process because they have a lot of things on their plate. And yes, they're doing you a favor, and yes, it's something that they should do well, but life happens. So setting up touch points, asking to see the recommendation, asking to provide comments, working collaboratively with them. Those are very important parts in making sure that your recommendations are on point, because this is an incredibly important part of the application to an admissions committee. It's the only somewhat objective third-party perspective that they have. So having somebody write a terrible recommendation is, or even a mediocre recommendation, is enough to get you dinged. We do ding reviews after every season, and you would be surprised at the types of recommendations that come across our desk. And more often than not, it is the first time an applicant has even seen the recommendations that were sent in. And they don't even need us to tell them that the recommendation was incredibly poor, because they can see it. And a lot of times they're surprised. But when we ask, how involved were you in the process? Did you prep them? Did you stay engaged? More often than not, the answer is no. So being actively engaged in this process is something you have to do. And then when you don't, that's a pitfall. And lastly, being kind of meek and unassertive. A lot of times people say, well, this person's doing me a favor, they're super busy. We get that. They are. But you have done hopefully a great job for them in the time that you have known them. Hopefully they are invested in your personal and professional success. And you have asked them for a favor, yes, but that by them accepting, they have acknowledged that they are on the hook to provide a good recommendation. And this is a huge deal for you. Whether it's a part-time program or a full-time program, it's a lot of time, it's a lot of money, and it's going to stay on your resume for the rest of your life, right? They have a responsibility to you. So don't be shy. Ask, right? Can I see the recommendation? Can I provide feedback? Can we have a touch point? Can I see how far along you've been? Do you have any questions, right? What else do you need from me to write a good recommendation? Those things are super important, and it's important to be assertive, obviously nice because you still have to work with them, but assertive in this process because it's something that's important to you. So that leads us, once again, to the Q&A portion of this. So if you guys have hopefully been writing, let me take a look at some of the questions that have come in. And obviously, if you have any, let me know. Let's see. Okay, some of these questions are, I think, not necessarily according to pitfalls, but they're good questions nonetheless. One of them, and I guess this is tied to what we had talked about earlier, is if my involvement is weak, where can I make up for this? There are three kind of levels of involvement that you can share in an application. Tier 1, kind of the best case scenario, you've been involved your entire life, and you tell them, your resume speaks for itself, right? That is the ideal case. If you don't have involvement since you graduated college, for example, then the second best case would be to say, hey, look at all this involvement I had in undergrad, and here's how I plan on being involved when I'm at your program. Not as strong, because obviously you didn't do anything for the years you were outside of college, right? But it's better than nothing. And if you don't have anything, well, first of all, that's a red flag. But then you can make up for it somewhat by advocating and showcasing how exactly you will be involved in the future. They're claims, they're unsubstantiated claims, obviously, because you haven't done anything before. But by showing that you've researched, by showing you know how you'll fit in, by showing that you have thoughts on how to contribute to the community, that's kind of your tier 3 option, right? But if you haven't been involved, then that's your only option. Or, like I said, you have a plan B, and you work on that in the meantime, and so that when if you do have a multi-year strategy, that doesn't look like you didn't work on that weakness at all. Let's see. Here's a good one, and actually this question brings up a good point, and I'll mention the question in a second. The question is about the GMAT. One of the pitfalls that I didn't mention, that maybe I should have, sometimes people focus too much on one aspect of the application, whether it's their essays or it's the GMAT. Those are generally the two biggest culprits. This process is holistic. Your application is holistic. You can't have great essays and terrible recommendations. You can't have a strong GMAT and awful essays. It all has to work together, and it all has to be strong. So the question was, how many tries is too many with the GMAT, and don't they just use my latest score? They do. And the GMAC last month in July changed their policy. You can now take it, I think, within 16 days. Score cancellations don't show up on your official score report. Now, obviously, GMAC did that so that they could get more revenue and entice people to take the test more often. But it works in the applicant's favor as well. How many times is too often? If you've taken it and you're not applying for a while, then continue to take it. Get the score you need, especially under the new rules, which are super lenient. But if you're already in August and you're applying for round 1 and you're applying to high-ranked schools and your GMAT is okay, understand the opportunity cost that's going to come with not focusing on your applications. And a lot of times this will happen. People will focus on the GMAT until the very, very end and finally get the score they want, hopefully. And that will all have been at the expense of the application itself. A good GMAT score in and of itself will not carry your application. So that's important, right? So at what point do you balance out the impact that studying and retaking the GMAT will have on your application? And at what point do you think, hey, the score is not high enough? And those kinds of conversations, if you're thinking about those questions, those kinds of conversations are best had with somebody who has experience. Right? Sign up with us and we'll chat with you about it. That's why we have our free consultations. This question, I guess, is in regards to in regards to the when to apply, or kind of the intra-year, multi-year. It says, how do you prioritize which school to apply to in which round? Generally, it comes down to what kind of an applicant you are, what your risk profile is, and what your kind of personal and professional commitments will look like, right? So if your risk profile is really low and you need to get in, and you're a very common type of applicant, then you need to apply to a very well-diversified set of schools in round 1. But if you're super unique and you need a little bit more time on your GMAT and there's not a lot of people like you, then maybe you can hit round 2. Or maybe you want to be more aggressive in round 1 and a little bit safer in round 2. But then you have to understand that come November, come December, you may be getting bad news. Or maybe you think your winter quarter at work is always the busiest. Then you should probably hit round 1 because you're not going to have time for round 2. There are a lot of factors that play in, and it comes down to kind of maximizing your chances, applying when you're ready, and taking into account kind of the rest of your life. Here's another one. What advice do you have for reapplicants to the top business schools? That's a bit of a vague question, but I'll take a pass at it. And to the person who asked it, if I don't specifically answer your question, let me know. What a reapplicant strategy is a delta strategy. What has changed, right? And that's all that really matters. So think really hard about what it was about your previous application that caused you to fail. And then start taking care of each one of those things one at a time. If your GMAT wasn't high enough, don't lie to yourself and tell yourself the rest of it will make up. You have to fix the GMAT. Or if you think your recommendations were poor, that's something to focus on. Or if you think your story was weak, then that's something you need to fix. Or if you don't think you did enough research last time around and you want to do more of it, that's something you should go out and do aggressively. So because at the end of the day, the advice very simply is show the school as much improvement as possible, right? For some people, that's a little bit harder to figure out than others, right? Sometimes people have terrible GMATs. Easy problem, go fix your GMAT score. But sometimes if your GMAT is in range, then it can be a bit confusing as to what might have been the cause. And the most important advice I would give to any reapplicant is be honest with yourself. You put a lot of time and effort and maybe money if you worked with an admissions consultant in a previous year. You put a lot of time, effort, and money into this. It is perfectly natural for you to want to think that it's somebody else's fault. Maybe the applicant pool was too competitive or the school didn't like you. But the fact of the matter is there's probably stuff that you could have improved. And kind of taking off the layers of that protect you in this process are going to be super important to figure out what you need to fix. Here's another one. Is it really necessary to make a school visit? And what if I can't? What if it's difficult? School visits are a very powerful signal. They are a great way to show a school that you're serious. Obviously, the amount of that signal goes up if you are international, right? It's far more expensive, but at the same time, it's difficult to visit sometimes, or maybe you don't have the money, or maybe you can't do it. School visits, in most cases, are very well received. Some schools care a little bit less than others, but almost every school out there appreciates them. Some kind of almost require it. We've had admissions directors tell us before, like, hey, if they can't come out and visit, and buy a $1,000 plane ticket, we don't really take them that seriously. That's a bit of a harsh perspective. It's up to each school. A way around that, each of these top schools make the circuit of the globe. They have events in cities around the world. Maybe you can't afford a $1,000 ticket, but maybe you can afford a $200 ticket to a town in another part of the country. Or if you can really articulate the kind of research that you've done and the conversations that you've had, then that's another way to kind of advocate your interest in the school. Because what a school is looking for is, are you invested in the process of learning about me? Another one just came in. Sorry, this one's a bit on the longer side. If you give me just 1 second. So this person comes from a unconventional background, nonprofit, and their question is that their recommenders generally don't have graduate or MBAs, or graduate degrees or MBAs, and what is that, how do you prep them? And then the second part of the question was, is it normal to kind of have one professional, one community involvement, something like that in terms of recommendation mix? To the first one, that is, if they haven't gone through the process, or if they're not used to the kind of programs that you're applying to, prepping them will be, there's an important part to the prepping that you'll have to do, which is to say this is going to be a collaborative process. You want to give them as much information as possible. You want to still give them examples and themes to touch upon, but then you're going to have to set up multiple touch points and say, okay, well, why don't we draft an outline and we can look at it together? Or maybe if you have a draft, I can provide feedback. Or, but setting that expectation at the very beginning is very important, because it'll give them, they don't want to screw up, right? They want to do a good job for you. So it's really a question of making sure that they're comfortable with the process. That is, I think, perhaps the most vital part of the prep process with somebody who's not familiar with it. In terms of kind of the mix of people, that really depends on where you're coming from and what kind of what kind of recommenders you have to choose from. Sometimes, in most cases rather, I would say people go with professional recommendations only. It's only when people have, or applicants have, a really strong community involvement recommendation that conversation can even be entertained. So I would say to your point about quote unquote the norm, there's no real norm, but the vast majority of applicants have primarily professional recommendations. And if any of them want to talk about the social or the softer side of the applicant, they can do that, but still coming from a professional standpoint. So it seems that is the last question that I have. So thank you all again for attending. Thank you. I know it's a bit late in the evening if you're in the US. If you're around the world, then it's super early, and thank you for your attendance. And if you're applying in round 1 or round 2 this year, good luck. If you need a hand, you can reach out to us, let us know. And outside of that, I will let you all go and enjoy the rest of your evening. And we hope to we hope you're all super successful in your application journey. Thanks again, guys.